Hello, hello. Welcome to part 3. Even though this says part 2, we're in this third section for chapter 8 lectures. We're getting into the ear, which is an exciting area. The ear houses two special senses, hearing and equilibrium. And the receptors are all called mechanoreceptors. They take in mechanical information and then we receive that information as either sound or balance. There we go. So there's three sections to the ear. The external ear starts here at this region called the auricle. This is like the trumpet region of the ear. And then we have this external acoustic or external auditory canal. And it ends at the tympanic membrane. The middle ear then starts at that tympanic membrane, houses the three auditory ossicles. These are the smallest bones in the body. We have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And then we end the middle ear at the oval window here, or the round window we have. Also within the middle ear, we have the pharyngotympanic tube, or the eustachian tube, which is what reduces the pressure of that middle ear. The inner ear then contains the receptors for hearing and equilibrium. So we have in the cochlea, we have receptors for hearing, and the base of the semicircular canals, which are these structures, and the vestibule, we have the receptors for equilibrium. So the external ear functions in taking in information from the external environment. Sound waves come in, they move in through the external ear, through that external auditory mediatus, and they hit the eardrum. Because this is open to the external environment, we do have special glands called ceremonious glands that produce earwax that protect the ear. And we also have tiny hairs in our ear that protect our ear from potential damaging materials. The middle ear then is an air-filled region. This is found within the temporal bone, and it functions in taking the information from the tympanic membrane and sending it in through the oval window to the inner ear, where we have the receptors for both sound and balance. Information then leaves, the vibrations leave through the round window and then can move down through that eustachian tube. So the eustachian tube is a tube in the middle ear that connects our ears with our throat, which helps in equalizing pressure of the middle ear cavity. Think about when you are flying, if you've ever flown, when you move up in altitude, a lot of times your ears have to pop. One of the best ways to do that is to chew on something, because your ear and your throat are connected through that eustachian tube. Also, if you have a throat infection, so strep throat or anything, you're more likely to get an ear infection, and vice versa. If you have an ear infection, you can get a throat infection very easily, especially as a child, because those eustachian tube is much shorter and it lays more horizontal versus vertical in adults. So within the middle ear, we have the three bones called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And so when the vibrations hit the tympanic membrane, they cause the malleus, incus, and stapes to vibrate. These vibrations then hit the oval window, and the information, the vibrations enter into the inner ear. So this portion here is that inner ear. So we're going to go into the inner ear and see what's happening. So in the inner ear, this is all part of the temporal bone still. We have a bony labyrinth that, and then we have a membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth is the temporal bone, which contains the cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canals. But within the bony labyrinth, we have a membranous labyrinth, which contains a fluid called perilymph. And again, that's in this area here. So we're going to go in and look at what happens. Equilibrium receptors are located within the vestibule. There's two types of equilibrium. We have static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. I didn't mean to hit the pause button. I meant to hit the next slide button. So right here is the vestibule. And so we have receptors for static equilibrium in the vestibule. And then at the base of the semicircular canals within the vestibule, we have dynamic equilibrium. Static equilibrium is equilibrium associated with movement in a straight direction, whereas dynamic equilibrium is movement in a rotational direction. So within the vestibule, we have a region called the macula, and that's where static equilibrium is associated. So this is what tells us where our head is in position to the rest of our body. Within the macula, we have hair cells. These hair cells are embedded into a gelatinous membrane called the otolithic membrane. Otoliths themselves are tiny little stones that float within the gel, and movement of the otoliths cause the membrane to move, which causes the hair cells to bend, which sends a signal to our brain. And so you see these otoliths up here. This is the otolithic membrane. Here are our hair cells, and any movement from these hair cells causes from the otoliths causes the gel to move, which causes the hair cells to bend, and that sends a signal down the vestibulocochlear nerve to our brain, and we recognize that as identifying movement of the body in a specific direction. So here we have movement of the head when we're shaking our head. There's an example of static equilibrium. Within the base of the semicircular canals, there's a region called the ampulla, and within the ampulla, we have a gelatinous material called the cupula. The cupula then within the cupula, we have hair cells again that are embedded. And as the cupula moves, it's going to cause the hair cells within that cupula to bend in specific directions. This will allow us to identify movement in rotations. So here we have the cupula, and this region is known as the ampulla. It's at the base of the semicircular canals. There's that little cupula, the cupula, and the cupula. There's hair cells embedded, so you can see those hair cells here. And as rotation occurs, it causes the cupula to bend in certain directions. And depending on which direction, with all three of the semicircular canals identifying directional forces, it's going to cause us to identify what direction we're moving. And so here's an example. Movement in a very rapid spin is going to be dynamic equilibrium, but we can identify that movement and we can maintain balance. So typically we focus on one spot and we keep that one spot focused on, and then we can keep our balance. So located within the cochlea of the inner ear, we have the receptors for hearing. These are embedded on a basilar membrane, and then the hair cells themselves are found within a gelatinous membrane called the tectorial membrane. So that gelatinous membrane is going to bend associated with those sound waves that move in. And so here you can see that basilar membrane. Here are those hair cells of hearing. And then you have this tectorial membrane, which contains, which is a gelatinous membrane, and then embedded are the hair cells associated with each of these cells for hearing. So as the hair cells themselves bend, they send a signal down to the vestibulocochlear nerve, the cochlear fibers of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that is what we take in for identifying sound. So the pathway, vibrations move from the tympanic membrane through each of the ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and then that amplifies the vibrations. Those vibrations then move into the inner ear through the oval window, and this increases pressure or produces pressure within the basilar membrane of the cochlea. The basilar membrane is found in what we call the organ of Corti, which is going to be where the hair cells are found. Hair cells that are embedded in the tectorial membrane are going to bend as the basilar membrane vibrates. It causes those hair cells to bend, and that sends a signal to the temporal lobe. So here you have vibrations move in. Then once they hit the eardrum or that tympanic membrane, the amplification occurs for the malleus, incus, and stapes. This enters the inner ear through the oval window, and the vibrations cause the cochlea, or not the cochlea, I'm sorry, the basilar membrane within the organ of Corti to flutter, and that causes the hair cells to bend. And then the vibrations exit through the round window and out through the eustachian tube. So we can hear different pitches associated with where the fluttering occurs. So if the receptor cells close to the oval window are stimulated, this is going to produce a high-pitched sound. Whereas if the receptor cells far away from the oval window are stimulated, this produces a lower pitched sound. And this is just that whole thing, a bigger picture of it, or the same size picture actually, just that here. All right, so at this point you should be able to answer these questions from the study guide. And the last thing we're going to talk about then is smell and taste.